Good evening. I'm Tim O'Shea, the Principal and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Edinburgh. A great pleasure to welcome you to the University of Edinburgh and to welcome you to its business school. We are very happy to host this event. It fits with our culture. The University of Edinburgh got seriously interested in Oriental languages about 350 years ago when we appointed our first professorship. And if you go to the library next door, you'll find wonderful resources that stem from that time and later from the Orient. In terms of students, the interaction with the East is more recent. In 1852, the first student from China to study in the West came to the University of Edinburgh to study medicine. Fairly obvious reasons. One, we were the world's preeminent medical school, and two, we're a university where you could talk in Mandarin or Cantonese to the staff. And if you go out to the Confucius Institute, there's a lovely statue of Huan Quan, the first Chinese student to study in the West at his home city. It's also the first Japanese student to study in the West came to us in 1871. Unlike Huan Quan, he came to study engineering. So we have a fairly good record. Coming to and that has been steadily building. And I think a key reason why the university has been so successful is in its engagement with Asia is a very high level of competence in the Asian languages. At the present time, the university has 31,000 students. 2,000 are from the People's Republic of China. And we have about another 200 each from Singapore, Taiwan, and from Hong Kong. So we have about 2,500 students whose first language is either Mandarin or Cantonese. And in December, I shall be spending a week in Taiwan, visiting our partner universities there. And then a little bit later, I shall be going to Beijing for the convention of the Confucius Institutes. The Chinese government funds 350 Confucius Institutes around the world. The largest and most successful is in Edinburgh. It's in a wonderful Scottish baronial building. And there, if you want to learn or improve your Chinese language skills, or eat dumplings, or play the chen, or get your calligraphy in order, there is a wonderful buzzing activity. And we will there'll be a nice event off Tiananmen Square in the Great Hall of the People. And 3 years in a row, we won the Best Confucius Institute in the World award. So I said to the Chinese government colleagues, please don't let us win it for a fourth year because it's really annoying the Germans. So, of course, the fourth year, we won it again. And the fifth year, the Chinese government, I'm a very modest person because I actually have a quite large gold and silver medal that was being given to me in China. So we have this very big Confucius Institute, very pleased with it. We also have Institute for Japanese Studies. It's one of two places recognized in Europe where you can do your Japanese proficiency test. And we have a strong connection, as many of you would know, with Korea. And of course, Korea has a thriving Presbyterian church, many of whose ministers were trained here. So there's strange links with China, very much originally medicine, with Japan very much originally in engineering, and our links with Korea started very much with divinity, and the most recent past president of Korea is a graduate of this university. Good links there. Something that is particularly distinctive to the university that we're very proud of is that we have the only, in the world, only centre for Japanese-Chinese understanding. So a famous philanthropist, you probably will all have heard of, Dr. Harishi Handa, who is ethnic Japanese, but very many relationships with China, and the study of China, decided that there needed to be a place in the world where the relationship between Japan and China could be understood, and that we were, because of our history, the right place for it. So we are really very pleased to be hosting this event. As I indicated, fits very much with our culture. And I'm extremely pleased to see so many of our Asian students in the audience. Thank you very much.
Well, Tim, thank you very much indeed. And my name is Roddy Gow. I am, with others in this room, some of the people in this room, the initiator and founder of the Asia-Scotland Institute. And after hearing from the principal about the distinguished history of this university, I feel somewhat awkward because we have been going for less than a year. But on the other hand, I'm immensely gratified that on this wet and windy evening, so many people have turned up, attracted, I hope, not only by the subject, but also by the generous hospitality of the business school, which follows the talk. So I'm very grateful to Sir Tim. I also want to say thank you to the Dean, who is not here, and Aidan Hetherington and his team for having made the event here possible and enabling us to use this fine auditorium. You will see that you're being filmed. If you don't like being filmed, hide under a chair or go, because we want to record this. We view you as being the studio audience, and my more modern, technically savvy colleagues who I see over there have told me that this will go out to, hopefully, hundreds of thousands of people who are the audience that we're also reaching out to. So I'd like to first of all now just introduce the format this evening. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Asia-Scotland Institute, and then Dr. Eamon Butler, who directs the Adam Smith Institute, we'll hear more about Adam Smith tonight, is going to speak to you about that, and then I will introduce Gerard Lyons, our guest tonight, who, as you know, is the global chief economist of the leading, probably, in many ways, emerging markets financial institution, Standard Chartered. Well, we conceived this concept of creating an Asia-Scotland Institute earlier this year, and we launched it with the help of Steve Hillier, Vice Principal International at the University, in the Playfair Library. And there were about 40 people there when we took our first sort of baby steps towards defining and explaining our mission. And I, having been involved with Asian affairs for some time, was always fascinated, as a sort of peripatetic Scot myself, you might say as something of a Piccadilly Highlander, by the extraordinary propensity of the Scots to travel far and wide. As we know, many travelled to the Americas, the Carnegies and others, and many others went east, Jardines, Mathesons, Eric Liddell in China, and many others, and had a huge impact on the countries of Asia. And I believed, as did others, that there was, if we think about the future leaders in Scotland, in our DNA, a connectivity between what many young people's grandparents and great-grandparents did and what lies within the Scots, beating in their hearts, that might take them back into Asia. And as we thought about this concept, it was clear that if we could help people in Scotland re-engage, not engage, but re-engage with the countries of Asia, it could have a huge economic impact on this country and be of terrific benefit not only to people, but also to companies small and large. So what we are is an institute in the process of formation. If you ever do this yourself, we had to go to the Scottish government to get permission to use the word Scotland. So we got that. And I had something of a debate with my learned colleagues as to whether you could have 3 verbs or whether there should be an adjective in there. But we ended up with this, and it was an interesting process. But our mission is to help Scottish companies and educational institutions engage with opportunities across Asia through providing access to innovative thinking and ideas. And additionally, we hope to be able to educate and inform the people of Scotland about Asia as a region, extending from the Gulf in the west to Japan in the east, and to foster and encourage business and cultural exchange. And we've started to do this through supporting other organisations like SCEN, the Scottish China Education Network, set up by Judith McClure, by working with the Power of Youth, some of whom are represented here, by Confucius Institutes, and over time with the different consular offices here, and I see some members of the consular community are here, and I'm delighted to see David Scott here representing Bangladesh, and there are others in the audience. And to ensure that by mounting programs in 3 areas, we could help them do that. And it's important you perhaps understand the holistic approach we're trying to adopt here. We want to produce and will produce programs in the areas of education, arts and culture. because those who watched what happened in Japan when there was the earthquake and the great tsunami and admired the extraordinary stoicism of the Japanese people could not really understand it unless they understood or understand Japanese culture. And so it is true of the many other cultures that exist within the different countries of Asia. Secondly, we want to engage around areas of business and economics, and very mindful of the extraordinary influence of that genius cluster in the late 18th century, known as the Age of Enlightenment, where Adam Smith, who is revered in China as a thinker, sat at Panmure House, and there are people here who are involved with the restoration of Panmure House, and talked with people like Hume and others about their ideas for the future. And as I've said to one or two people and heard, one evening, Adam Smith said to his friends, "Gentlemen, this conversation will be continued at another place at another time," and went upstairs and died and is buried in the Canongate Kirk here in Edinburgh. So business and economics, and that's why we want to launch the Adam Smith series of global economic briefings. And Gerard very generously is kicking that off tonight. But just to let you know that Professor Danny Kwa, the Kuwait Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics, will be speaking in March. Stephen King, Global Chief Economist of HSBC, will come on the 16th of May. Jim O'Neill, Chairman of Goldman Sachs Asset Management, on the 17th of July. And that great iconoclast, Lord Desai, Emeritus Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics, in September later in the year. In the field of culture, we will kick this off on the 31st of January, when Shanyan Fok, who is the owner of the Hua Gallery in London, will come and talk about the contemporary Chinese art revolution. And we do expect to be putting in place other programs as the year proceeds. Additionally, in the field of policy and politics, we've started to talk with ambassadors from key countries in Asia. The ambassador of Mongolia to the Court of St. James will come to Scotland and speak about his country and is very interested in engaging with Scotland. They need teachers of English. One of Scotland's great USPs is education. And the ambassador of Vietnam and the High Commissioner from India and the ambassador from China all are interested in coming up here as part of that program. And finally, we hope and plan, working with the Edinburgh Festival, to launch our own festivals of literature, film and music, and you will find us involved also in book launches, books written by scholars about Asia. So we're starting on our journey. I see some faces in here who are closely involved with helping us. We welcome you on board tonight and hope you'll follow what we're doing and assist us as we move forward with what we think is a hugely timely and important mission. So thank you for that, and I'm delighted to hand over to Dr. Eamon Butler.
Thank you very much. Well, Roddy has done most of the organisation for this, but he's very kindly doing it in partnership with the Adam Smith Institute. And so it's a great honour for us to be involved in it. I just wanted to add my 1 minute welcome, really. Adam Smith, of course, famously wrote that China has been one of the richest, that is, one of the most fertile, best cultivated, most industrious and most populous countries in the world. It seems, however, he said, to have been long stationary. Well, that, I think we'll learn, has changed in the last few years. So it's very appropriate that we should be here. Many of you will probably not be familiar with the Adam Smith Institute, and you will wonder what it is. Well, it is a think tank, although many people say that we've already gone septic. It's non-profit. Again, we don't always plan it that way. That's just the way it turns out. And it is non-party. We don't get involved in day-to-day politics. Politics, as you may know, is a word made up of two separate words: poly, meaning a lot of, and ticks, which are nasty little bloodsuckers. So we try to advise politicians, although we do it against their will, I have to say. And they always say, you know, well, how many politicians does it take to screw in a light bulb? And the answer is, it doesn't matter, but it would be done much better than it was under the last administration. So these are the things that we have to deal with, and we try to promote policies and indeed the thinking, which I suppose Adam Smith would have championed, of free markets and free economy and free people. And we do that through reports and briefings and events, trying to spread enlightenment. So my message to you is keep calm and talk to the invisible hand. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Eamon. I just want to quickly introduce Gerard Lyons. To those of you who don't know, as I said, he's the Chief Economist and Group Head of Global Research at Standard Chartered. He's also an economic advisor to the board and a member of the bank's executive forum. Previous roles at the bank include member of the Global Markets Management Team and the Risk Management Committee. Gerard's held senior roles at leading international financial firms since starting in the city 25 years ago, and his previous positions include chief economist at DKB International, consultant to the Daiichi Kangyo Bank, Tokyo, chief economist at the Swiss Bank Corporation, beginning his career with Chase Manhattan. He gained his PhD, interesting, on testing the efficiency of financial futures markets at the University of London. He is involved with a number of other important academic institutions. He's a council member of the University of Warwick, Vice Chairman of the 48 Group, China, member of the Advisory Board of the Grantham Institute of Climate Change, committee member of the Hong Kong Association, member of the International Council of the Bretton Woods Committee, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. He's on the panel of economic advisors to the Mayor of London, and I think is probably Boris's key economic advisor, so we hope he's giving him good advice. He has also held other positions, such as chair of the steering committee of the Asia Study Group at Chatham House, and he's a committee member of the Centre for Economic Policy Research, and in 2006 was UK co-chair of the UK-Hong Kong Business Partnership. At the end of 2010, he was appointed a fellow of the Society of Business Economists and elected to the Council of the Royal Economic Society, and in early 2011 became a member of the European Commission's informal network of China experts, and so on. Based in London, we know he travels widely, so we're particularly glad that he managed to make it the day after Thanksgiving, which was yesterday, and he speaks often to the bank's clients, meeting policymakers and addressing audiences around the world. Born in Kilburn, London, married with 3 teenage children, and now lives in Kent, and he is a supporter not of Manchester United, but of Fulham Football Club, which he enjoys, and also viewing his wife's art and watching his children participate, apparently in their stand-up comedy, drama, and various sports. So with that background, as you can see, he is pretty well qualified to talk to us today about how China and Asia are changing the world. So thank you.
Good evening. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. It's a great honour, great pleasure to be here this evening. I'm delighted to be asked to give the first talk in this series, particularly as the next 4 speakers are fantastically good, and I'd love to be able to come up to listen to them speak. It's even more interesting that I'm here tonight in the not the birthplace, sorry, where Adam Smith died, and indeed where he did most of his work alongside Glasgow. And it's also, I'm delighted to be able to support the Asian Scotland Institute and its excellent objectives. The title of my talk this evening is How China and Asia Are Changing the World. I will try and add interpretations of how I would view Adam Smith seeing this topic as we go along. And I'm going to focus on 3 areas. First, on how the world is changing. There is a shift in the balance of economic power. Second, I will then focus on China, because that's central to how all this will play out. And then third and finally, the implications for the world and for us here in this room. So first, the world is changing. I could quote lots of economic statistics, but I'll try and keep that to a minimum. There are 3 types of economists. There's the economists who can count and the economists who can't count. So you'll understand why I won't use too many statistics tonight. But the statistics I will use are 32, 62, 72. At the beginning of this century, the world economy was $32 trillion in size. Hard to picture it, but pretty big amount. At the beginning of the financial crisis, or indeed the evening before Lehman Brothers went belly up, the world economy was just under $62 trillion in size. At the end of this calendar year, despite what's happened in the West, despite the financial crisis, the world economy will reach $72 trillion in size. So the world economy is growing. Those are nominal figures. Some of that growth is inflation, but the vast, vast, vast bulk of it is real economic activity led primarily by the emerging economies and in particular by China and Asia. So there is a shift in the balance of power, but it's not naturally the first shift in the balance of power. Indeed, Adam Smith, when he was writing The Wealth of Nations, did spend some of that talking about the relationship between America and Britain, or Great Britain as it was called at that time. And it's interesting to note that even then, Adam Smith was arguing that within 100 years, he expected the output of America to overtake that of Britain. And to quote him, he said, the seat of empire would then naturally remove itself, he said, from London to Philadelphia. Indeed, that period when America replaced Britain in terms of the shift in the balance of power at the end of the 19th century is relevant, in my view, for understanding what's happening now. I believe the world economy is in a super cycle of economic growth. If I say that in the West, people tend to think I've been smoking something. If I say it in Asia, people nod and think, yeah, well, what's the big fuss about that? But I would also argue we've seen it before. At the end of the 19th century, from indeed 1870 to 1913, the world economy had a significant step up in economic growth. It was very volatile growth. Indeed, there were lots of bank crises. No surprise maybe there. But the key ingredient then was that America went from the fourth to the first biggest economy in the world. And also at the same time, we saw the adoption of technologies that had been developed but had yet been fully introduced from the Industrial Revolution. The world economy really had a super cycle of growth. The second period I think that's relevant for understanding now is from after the Second World War until the early 70s. Then the world economy had its strongest rate of economic growth ever, growing on average in real terms by 5% per annum. It's when Europe decided to grant itself a welfare system it can't afford, but more particularly, it's the period of growth when, whereas America at the end of the 19th century really emerged on the scene, this time it was Japan and a number of the Asian economic tigers. In addition, we saw the growth of consumer durable markets in the West and naturally the bounce back after the Second World War. This time, in my view, we're seeing similar characteristics. This time it's the emergence of Asia and China. This time it's growth of consumer durable markets on the other side of the world. And this time it's also the growth of new trade corridors. But yet, if I was standing here now, I could easily construct a pessimistic downbeat scenario of the world economy, and it could easily be believable. America, China, Europe, and indeed many other places face challenges. Lots of people talk about the fiscal cliff in America. Well, it's a fiscal cliff, it's also a regulatory mountain, and it's a jobs depression. But despite that, America seems to be experiencing the steady, not spectacular recovery. Europe basically is fatally flawed, but will probably be kept afloat by Germany and the European Central Bank. China, as I'll come on to, faces some significant challenges. But India and other economies across Asia and the emerging world really do need to reform. And on top of that, we have the challenges from the Middle East, which could easily lead to higher commodity prices. In fact, the complex outlook for the world economy means that you should take these downside risks seriously. But at the same time, you shouldn't only look at the downside risks. I would argue currently there are about three big structural themes impacting the world economy. One is the shift in the balance of power, which is a positive. It's making the global economic cake bigger and bigger, 32, 62, 72. Another key theme is the structural shift that's taking place, not only in some people's own lives, but many companies, and indeed a number of economies. 3.5 years ago, President Obama's Chief of Staff, Mr. Emanuel, said, look, let's not waste a good crisis. He was referring then naturally to the USA. One could easily argue that over the intervening 3.5 years, a number of Asian and other economies have not wasted the crisis. Vietnam, Bangladesh have fundamentally changed. You see strong underlying growth in many Asian economies. In the West, we tend to think high value added jobs naturally come to the West. Low value added jobs go elsewhere. That's completely wrong. High value added jobs can go anywhere, and even the West needs lots of low value added jobs. Structural change is taking place, and whereas the shift in the balance of power is a big positive, the structural shift, it very much depends on where you are and what you're doing as to whether it's a negative or a positive. But the other change is the debt deleveraging as a result of the crisis. That naturally is a negative. America is probably more than halfway through it. Britain and continental Europe are maybe only at the halfway stage. How would Adam Smith have viewed this if he'd been alive now? Well, he would have been shocked by the level of debt. Adam Smith outlined what he thought were man's positives. He tended not to say women's positives, so you can decide for yourself about the positives or negatives in a minute. But for man, he said, first they trucked and bartered, whatever that meant. They bettered his condition. But then he said the third and the fourth positives for man were that he saved and that he was prudent. And he thought, why wouldn't you save? So he probably would be shocked by why people borrowed so much. But the underlying arguments as to why you need to save are very much intrinsic across many Asian economies. Indeed, before the financial crisis a few years ago, one of the catchphrases we had at Standard Chartered was that Asia was not decoupled from events in the West, but it was better insulated. Not decoupled because it sold goods to the West and would be hit by any events in the West, but better insulated largely because governments had better macroprudential policies, partly because they had a crisis 13 years ago, but more particularly the private sector in Asia did very much, as Adam Smith said, saved a lot. Now, Adam Smith did say that people had some negatives, or man had negatives. Women in the room might agree with the first negative he had of man, which was that man was lazy. Also, he said that there was a big disconnect between man pursuing his own interests and doing something for the public good. And more particularly, the phrase with which Adam Smith is often quoted and associated is he said there was a tendency for institutions or people to monopolise. Indeed, after the financial crisis hit, Lord Maurice Peston in the House of Lords debate quoted this phrase from Adam Smith: "People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public." Indeed, Smith was in favour of self-interest, but was very wary of collective self-interest. Consequently, he was seen as being critical of business, and consequently, if he had been alive now, he would very much have been critical of banks and of the role banks played in this crisis. But there were some other aspects of Smith that I think are also very relevant for understanding now. Smith was basically multidisciplinary. He was a philosopher who became an economist, but it was amazing to think that after his death, 3 books were published, or 3 essays rather. One was the history of ancient physics, one was the history of ancient logic and metaphysics, and one was astronomy. And one could argue that you do need to be multidisciplined to understand how the financial sector works and how the world economy works. Many economists are now looking to biology as an indication of how the world economy works. And one of the big areas that some economists are looking to is network theory. The idea is that if you hit the nodes of a network, the system collapses. So if you hit the nodes of an economy, it collapses as well. The point is that Smith was multidisciplinary at a time when it was probably accepted to be. In recent years, or decades, people have become very focused on certain disciplines, and the crisis itself, or since then, has highlighted the need to be more multidisciplinary. Also at the same time, Smith was a big advocate of trade. He looked a lot, as I mentioned, at America and Great Britain. He highlighted 4 areas between Britain and America: the difference in terms of institutional arrangements, the difference in terms of the maturity of the 2 economies, factor endowments, i.e. what each economy was given to begin with, and regulation, particularly in the area of trade. Some of these issues are very relevant, in my view, for understanding the world economy now, particularly endowments. In this shift in the balance of power, I would argue that the winners around the world will be those countries that have at least one of the 3 Cs: the cash, the commodities, or the creativity. Those economies with the cash are sometimes the same economies with the commodities. But also, here in Britain, you could argue that we don't have much of the cash left. The commodities, well, in England, we tend to say the Scots use them up far too quickly. Scotland would say the commodities are ours to begin with. But whichever way you look at it, North Sea oil has long gone and peaked. So Britain has to rely not on the cash or the commodities, but very much on the creativity. But the other area that Smith really focused on is vitally important for understanding why China and Asia are so important now, and that's trade. Smith was a big advocate of a free trade agreement. Doha Round, most people tend to shut their eyes when you hear about the Doha Round. Doha Round was a bit like Murder on the Orient Express. Everyone had a say or word in killing it. It was killed by every single player, it seemed. Instead, we've moved to bilateral and regional trade deals. Indeed, it's interesting to note that this last week, President Obama was in Asia for a regional meeting at which one of the big themes was not just the disputes in the South China Seas between China and other countries, but the signing of 2 big free trade agreements between ASEAN, Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia as an economic region is bigger in size than India. ASEAN is signing free trade agreements with Northeast Asia and also with Australia, New Zealand. Indeed, new trade corridors is one of the big underlying themes in this shift in the balance of power. That means trade flows between Asia have risen, trade between Asia and Africa, Asia and Middle East, Asia, Latin America, usually with China at the centre of it. So Smith, in arguing for a free trade agreement, would have had many supporters in Asia now in arguing against any protectionism in the West. But to conclude the first part, I would say that there is a shift in the balance of economic power, and that shift is in economic terms. But very importantly, it's unlike the shift 120 odd years ago when Britain lost out to America, because we're not yet seeing the shift in other terms. We're not yet seeing the shift in financial terms, in soft power terms, in military terms, or indeed in political terms. Still, America and other countries in the West have a dominant role. But the second part of my talk is going to focus on the key economy in terms of how this will play out, not just America, but China. Indeed, if you look to the year ahead, it's interesting to say that it's possibly a bipolar world will be the story of 2013. America is experiencing, in my view, a steady, not spectacular recovery, as I said. China is experiencing a soft landing. Europe is still being held back. The most important words, in my view, that President Obama has used in his first term in office were the words and the words pivot. Soon after he became president, President Obama changed the relationship with China from a strategic economic relationship to a strategic and economic relationship. And, another and, this time a year ago, he talked of the pivot, the fact that America would pivot itself with Asia in economic, political, and military terms. That naturally has to raise questions for where Europe plays out in this. But where does China come out in this? In my view, people in the West don't get it about China and indeed about other countries. The pace and scale of change is dramatic. China is undergoing an industrial revolution. The catch-up potential also is huge. China is now the second biggest economy in the world, but in terms of income per head, it's about 89th. It's on a par with the Dominican Republic. I've been to many countries, not the Dominican Republic, but when people think of the Dominican Republic, they don't think of an economic giant or an economy that's particularly rich. But when you think that China is the second biggest economy, yet its income per head is on a par with the Dominican Republic, that suggests its catch-up potential is still huge. One of the fascinating features of the last few years was that in the wake of the financial crisis, on one of his numerous visits to the UK, Wen Jiabao, still the Premier of China, talked about Adam Smith in one of his keynote speeches in London. And it's interesting, and he also said the same when he gave a similar speech at Cambridge at that time. He said he found it difficult to understand why in America and Europe, people always talked about Adam Smith's invisible hand, and why no one talked about Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, and how in that book he talked about the need for morals and ethics. And I thought it was quite ironic to have a Chinese premier in a country that doesn't have democracy coming to the West to talk about morals and ethics. But what might Smith think of China? Dr. Butler has already mentioned that, something, I won't repeat that, but the lack of democracy probably would be very familiar to Smith. I found it amazing to read that in his day, Adam Smith was not able to vote here in the United Kingdom because he didn't pass the 40 shilling threshold. You have to have land worth 40 shillings to be able to vote. And indeed, Hume also wasn't able to vote, but only about 3% of the population. Not only that, maybe similarities to parts of China now, the press was not allowed to report on Parliament or any parliamentary debates in Britain at that time, else it was going to be accused of a breach of privilege. And at that time, it's interesting to read that people in the City of London demanded, the City of London was always seen as slightly different to Westminster, demanded that the debates be covered by the press. As a result, one of those officials who called for the coverage of the debates was shipped off to the Tower of London and no longer called for the debates to be publicised. So lack of democracy, people talk about. But I think what's interesting is that in the current change in Chinese leadership, in China, democracy has been seen as an important issue. But maybe not in the way we think about it. The new leadership is going to be addressing democracy in terms of corruption and accountability of officials, not necessarily in terms of people having the vote. And indeed, maybe it's because the economic cake is still getting bigger that people's focus on democracy in China is very different to maybe our focus now. More importantly for many people in China is the whole issue of reform and whether the new leadership will reform. Now, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, President Hu Jintao, Premier Wen Jiabao, they are still President and Premier until the March National People's Congress, even though the new leadership has come in. As you probably understand, in China, the party is more important than the state. And at the recent meeting, the party roles have changed. It's next March that the leadership roles for the states change. So we only really know what the new leadership thinks probably this time next year, when traditionally they give their State of the Union or State of the Country address. But President Wen Jiabao, President Hu Jintao and Premier Wen Jiabao a few years ago talked about China's 5 imbalances. And these imbalances, I think, are still very important for understanding how people in China see the economy now. They talked of one imbalance between coastal and inland areas. Coastal areas doing better. Second imbalance was between cities and rural areas. Cities naturally doing better. Third was social imbalance. The fact that it was only a couple of years ago that state education was made mandatory for school children. The fact that people in China still don't feel they have a proper health system. So social issue is very important. Fourth issue is environmental. Sometimes when you go to China, you can't see the sky. You might complain about the rain here. You wouldn't like the rain if you're in Chongqing because it probably would have lots of pollution in it. Pollution is a big issue. And indeed, it's interesting to note that some of the biggest critics of the government in China feel the best way they can criticise the government is by getting involved in the green or in the environmental debate. And the other fifth imbalance was the international imbalance, China's peaceful rise. It's only in the last year since President Obama has talked about the pivot and since China has started to have bigger disputes with some of its neighbours over the East and South China Seas that this issue has come back to the head. But when you look at China now, the important thing is to understand that China has come a long way in 30 years, but now it's going through its real test. China has gone from low income to middle income. In China, the big debate is the so-called middle income trap. Can it go from middle income to high income? It's difficult to say how many countries tend to make that leap, but generally speaking, people say 1 in 3 countries make that change from middle income to high income. But to go from middle income to high income means fundamentally changing China's economy. China last year had its 12th five-year plan. It highlighted the need to boost consumption. China's economy is heavily focused on investment and exports. People don't spend enough, partly because people save, as Adam Smith said they should, but they don't spend. So China needs to encourage people to spend more. The other aspect of last year's 12th five-year plan was that China wants to boost the social welfare system to address some of those imbalances that I touched on. And also, very importantly, is trying to boost the green economy. On top of all that, is trying to rebalance the economy towards more sustainable growth. In recent years, China has had double-digit growth. Trouble about China's statistics, it's a bit like Britain's national statistics. No one actually believes them, but they're the best guide we've got. China releases its national statistics quicker than any other country in the world, and I always joke that they're always in line with official expectations. But China is moving from growth of double-digit to somewhere near 7 to 7.5%. Now, they hope to do that, but many would argue they need to reform further. But it's no secret, well, I'm not an expert on Chinese politics, and I don't pretend to be. I naturally follow it very closely and meet many of the people when I go to China. But you yourselves, if you've been following the leadership change this year, will notice that there's been a big debate linked very much not just around personalities, but about the reform agenda. Earlier this year, China released a World Bank report, the 2030 report. I didn't really appreciate until one of my visits to China earlier this year and spending 2 days at the party school how important this World Bank report was. In a nutshell, it said that China can't innovate. The way I interpret that is that China needs to buy foreign. The 3 words, in my view, that characterized the last decade were not war and terror, but were made in China. In fact, probably something you're wearing tonight is made in China. Even if you're wearing the most expensive item, it's probably made in China, but hidden in the corner of the garment. But more and more things, high value added, are made in China. I think the 3 words that will characterize the next decade will be bought by China. China, like a number of other countries across Asia, needs to move up the value curve. That means they need to buy brands, they need to buy intellectual property, they need to buy high technology. Continental Europe is seen, and I'm quoting what some official has said in public, Continental Europe has a Cold War approach to Chinese inward investment. I think that's partly a reflection of the fact that continental Europe as a whole is doing poorly. Britain, in contrast, is not resisting Chinese inward investment. It's trying to encourage it. But the Chinese investment into Britain is more passive. It's taking stakes in companies like Thames Water rather than actively buying outright UK companies. But there's no doubt that China needs to move up the value curve, hence last year's 12th five-year plan, hence this year's World Bank report, hence the focus ahead of this leadership change on whether China can move up the value curve. But I think in saying China will succeed, an important thing is that everyone's trying to double guess whether China has a hard or soft landing. For what it's worth, I think it will have a soft landing, growing at 7.5% this coming year, but I don't think that's the key issue. China is an up and away economy, but I think China will have setbacks along the way. And this is, again, very relevant to something Adam Smith talked about. Adam Smith talked about basically the rule of law, the need to regulate the markets, and he highlighted for Britain how Britain would do well because the security of law meant that everyone should enjoy the fruits of his labour. The challenge about China is infrastructure. When we talk about infrastructure, we often think of roads and rail. But infrastructure is not just hard infrastructure. On hard infrastructure, China is top of the list. Britain is not too bad, although you wouldn't realise it if you went on the roads in southeast London or if you tried to take a train across the country. Trains used to be far better than they are now, in my view. But let's not get onto that point. But hard infrastructure, China does really well. Soft infrastructure is skills and education. China is pretty much like Britain. Top end, phenomenal. Top of the world. Bottom end, not very good. In Britain, roughly a quarter of school leavers can't read and write and count properly. In China, it was only 3 or 4 years ago that state education, as I touched on, was made mandatory, 9 years state education for school children. At the top end, we always think of China doing really well, but at the bottom end, it has big challenges. But it's really the institutional infrastructure that Adam Smith, if he was alive today, in my view, would have commented on. The things we take for granted in the West, the rule of law, democracy, the ability to have intellectual property rights protected, are issues that China still has to come to terms with. Therefore, I think it's important that when we look at China, I'm bullish about China. I think the trend will be up. I think the issue of hard versus soft landing is an important one, but I think far more relevant to say that China will have some significant setbacks along the way. Those people who are pessimistic about China are like stopped clocks. They're no use in helping you tell the time, but they will be right at some stage. That's not being disrespectful to the issues they're highlighting. I think what they highlight in terms of the negative issues about China are very real. But you shouldn't look at them solely. You have to look at them in the context of everything else. But overall, I think China is on an upward trend, an upward path, and write it off at your peril. And I think it will continue to do well, albeit with setbacks along the way. Third and finally, last 5 minutes, what are the implications? I think there are so many implications. But in terms of bringing it back to where we are now, whichever economy you look at, whether it's Scotland, Britain or China, India or any other economy in Asia, the outcome depends on the interaction between the fundamentals, policy and confidence. The fundamentals in Asia, I think, are good. Fundamentals in the West are not so good. Confidence here in the West is very fragile. In Asia, it's pretty good. Policy, I think, is the most interesting issue. The policy outlook is very complicated. But in my view, globally, we've moved from the 3 S's to the 3 T's to the 3 U's, and these have significant and possibly negative implications for Asia in a few years' time. The 3 S's are that as the crisis hit, global policy was synchronized, it was sizable, and it was successful. The London summit with the G20 saw China play an important role, and led by Prime Minister Brown, all the major countries came together and stimulated the world economy to prevent a depression. It worked. We then went through another phase of policy, the 3 T's, particularly in Asia. Policy then became very timely, very targeted, and temporary. India tackling inflation, China tackling inflation too. But now we have policy being the 3 U's. It's a case of being monetary policy in the West is now the shock absorber for the world economy. And monetary policy in the West is now unlimited. Monetary policy has just been let rip. China, you could argue, gets included in that. The balance sheets of central banks in China, Japan, Britain, America, Europe, and Switzerland have never been higher. The second U is unclear what are the near-term implications. Central banks were arguing they're stopping the situation getting worse, but they're certainly not making it get much better. And the third U is the unknown longer-term consequences. And across Asia, there is a fear that inflationary pressures are around the corner. Westerners are underinvested in Asia. If you want to look for yield or for growth, you have to buy the emerging economies. There's plenty of liquidity because of the balance sheets of the central banks pumping money into the system. That money, in my view, is likely to find a home eventually in Asia. But many of the emerging markets are not big enough to absorb these future inflows. So when the money flows in, it's a bit like foreign money going into the London property market and pushing up prices there. This money will go into Asia, and it's likely to be seen in higher inflation, particularly in equity markets and in land values. That's why many central banks across Asia are reluctant to ease policy now. What else does it mean? I think when you look at Asia, it's important to say that it's going to become more important in the global economy, more important in terms of how Britain should view Asia. The big debate down in Westminster is whether Britain should or shouldn't leave the European Union. The big debate, in my view, should be about how Britain positions itself in a changing global economy, and in particular how we continue to export more to Asia, compete more with Asia, and attract more investment from Asia. And to conclude, what does it mean for you? Well, the writings of Adam Smith have inspired many different groups. Naturally, I would encourage you to read them. It's great that you're here in Edinburgh, given the Enlightenment phase. But actually, when I was here in August at the Fringe, I remember going with one of my daughters who's hoping to study medicine. We went to the medics museum, which was amazing. If it not been in there, I'd recommend it. And you can see what Lister was doing in the middle of the 19th century in terms of medicine. But more importantly, I think for you guys in the room, Britain can compete on cost or on value. Cost or on quality. Basically, if we compete on cost, someone somewhere else will do it cheaper and maybe even better. We need to move up the value curve, which means we need to continue to try and move into those high value-added areas as Asia is doing. Education plays a key role. And more importantly, I think we need to think globally, given the shift in the balance of power. Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand of competition and self-interest. I would interpret that as playing to our strengths as a nation. And more importantly, what he said in the theory of moral sentiments, I think we should do it with the right morals and ethics. I've concluded my 30 minutes, but to bring it all together, I think there's a shift in the balance of power. As I said, that there are three areas. First, the shift in the balance of power from the west to the east, and the countries that do well in that will have the cash, the commodities, or the creativity. Second, China's role within this. The trend will be up, but there will be setbacks along the way. And third and finally, the implications for us. It's not just about the near-term outlook and policy and how that plays out, but more importantly, for people in this room to be thinking globally, not just now, but definitely in the future as well. Thank you for your time.
Name's Steve Halliday. What form might the setbacks take?
Setbacks in China. Yeah. What form might the setbacks in China take? Many different forms. I think if we look at what's happening to the world economy now, part of the challenge in the West is the economic cake is not getting bigger. Hence, all the issues that were issues before have now come to the surface. So I think the biggest challenge for China would be if economic growth stalled or slowed. And then the tensions would very much come to the fore. As long as the economy is growing, you can always bury the issues. To put in perspective, investment as a proportion of GDP in China is 48%. If you knock a tenth off investment, which you can easily do in any minor downturn, that knocks, or potentially 4.8% of Chinese GDP. So that shows why Premier Wen Jiabao has talked about the unstable economy. Basically, when you have an economy so dependent on investment, it just can have a small setbacks and that hits growth. The other issues for people in China is corruption, accountability, and the quality of life, actually. Environmental challenges are really far bigger than many people really take. And within that, it's issues such as water. That's why I would argue there's many demonstrations about chemical plants opening up. The problem with Chinese water is they don't have enough of it. What's there is in the wrong place, and much of it's polluted. So you can see many macroeconomic challenges, particularly growth slowing, but there's many non-economic, i.e. social challenges as well.
I'll take one right at the back.
Rather he ran up the stairs than myself.
There we go.
You have covered made in China will change from made in China to made for China, bought by China. So what particularly opportunities you can see for British business in China? Thank you.
Thank you. It's always dangerous talking about China when there's people who probably know far more about China in the room. But yeah, thanks for the question. Opportunities for British business. I think one of the big opportunities is the scale of the market. And I would say, I would answer this not just about China, but about ASEAN, Southeast Asia, and also about India as well. China's population starts to age in 1 or 2 years' time. India's population remains very young. The 1 in 11 people in the world is an Indian under 25. So the big opportunity for British people is the scale of the domestic markets in these economies. Now, China is having a big positive impact in Germany. German trade with China is almost outstripping German trade with France. And basically, Germany is exporting capital goods, high-end goods, manufactured goods to China. The argument would be that Britain because of its focus on business and financial services, both here in Edinburgh, say, as well as other parts of the country, particularly London. Britain can do well as China and indeed as Asia moves to the next stage of development. I don't just want to answer it in terms of China, but just after the crisis at the annual Asian Development Bank meeting, it was highlighted that for Asia generally to move from export-led growth to domestic-driven growth, and hence become more important for the world economy, Asia needed three things. It needed social safety nets to discourage people from saving too much, hence get people to spend more. It needed help to SMEs, to small, medium-sized enterprises, because they were key for job generation. And it needed deeper and broader bond markets, so you have capital markets there to support the economic development of the country. So in answer to your question, I think Britain selling business and financial services is particularly important into China and indeed to the rest of Asia, as well as Britain exporting into the growing domestic market in China. Thank you.
I'll take one here, a bit closer.
Thank you. Sandy Dudgeon. I mean, just thinking of both India and China, it's easy, I understand, talking about economic growth, we all get that. But at what point, given your experience in history, do the elements of non-economic factors, leaving aside, let's say, freeing up of exchange rates, so I mean by that things like the rule of law, the social pressures, actually come to bear and just stop economic growth because there's a huge level of uneducated people, their infrastructure doesn't work, corruption remains higher than reasonably can be expected. I mean, there are a lot of things going on in those areas which seem to me to be natural breaks on the glorious economic growth that we so easily talk about, whether it's 7.5 or 5. Yeah.
Well, thank you for the question. Apart from when you mentioned corruption, I thought the question could be applied to the United Kingdom very easily. And Britain ticks, unfortunately, too many of those criteria. But yeah, you're right. Whichever economy it is, growth is not guaranteed. Economic success is not deliverable, always. And to highlight it, I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk that there was a period of phenomenal economic growth at the end of the 19th century. It's hard to believe that at that time, one of the many debates in the City of London was which emerging economy offers the best potential. Was it America, or was it, and can you believe the other country? Argentina. The fact that you look back now 150 years ago, 140 years ago, and think, how could people have seen Argentina in the same light as America? And yet it had all the potential. In fact, I was in Latin America this time a year ago, and I was told a joke in Chile about Argentina, and the fact it's going out on the TV, well, it doesn't matter, it's Argentina. Basically, the Chileans said that when God made the world, Angel Gabriel came to God and said, God, you've made a mistake. God said, I never make mistakes. And the Angel Gabriel said, yes, God, you have. You've created this land. It's got the best of everything. It's got the best soil. It's got the best climate, the best temperature, the best rivers, the best of the sea, the best of everything. And God said, don't worry, I'll put the Argentinians there. and the point is that Argentina had it all going for it, but didn't deliver. America did. And I think this is very relevant for the debate about India and China. Institutions, as Adam Smith wrote about, are incredibly important. It's remarkable to think that our Prime Minister, David Cameron, was being quizzed about Magna Carta on the David Letterman show. But something from 750 years ago that some people would argue would be a positive thing for some countries across the world now. Greater accountability and role, well, then it was greater role for the landowners, etc. But the point is that institutional change, I think, is a very important part of all this. So you're right, the corruption issue that you asked about in your question, I think is very important. So I do think that you need to get to the stage where the rule of law is greater than that of any individual or any institution. So how the party in China plays out remains to be seen. But it's not just China. India over the last year has seen a significant slowdown in growth, even though India has a phenomenal working democracy. And India has not delivered on the other aspects. It has the institutional setup, but it's not delivered on the deregulation or the infrastructure spend. So even if you get the institutional setup right, you do need to deliver on the hard and soft infrastructure. Or if China is delivering on the hard and soft infrastructure, it needs to deliver on the institutional infrastructure. And maybe just to bring it further, when we look at this shift in the balance of power, given what I was just saying, it doesn't, in my view, mean that the West naturally loses out. The West can still do well in this. I am very positive about America and how America will play itself out despite near-term challenges. It's less clear to me how Europe will play itself out in coming years, but the West still can do well in this because many of the things we take for granted are very important characteristics of successful economies. Thanks.
I'll take one just here.
Thank you. Gerard, one of the problems that external investors have had with China is the problems of corporate governance and transparency. And this has been a real handicap, particularly for equity investors in China. Now, when do you expect these things to change?
Yeah, I think it will change. The challenge about China is that I think there are so many issues they've got on the agenda. Some of the things you've argued about are probably less important. The financial system in China needs to be opened up. It's a repressed financial system. If you're an individual in China, what can you do with your money? Well, apart from getting it out of the country, you've got a choice of putting it into bank deposits where interest rates are low because they're regulated. You put it into real estate, hence everyone in China believes property prices will go up. Or as Bill was asked in the question, you put it into the stock market, but corporate governance is not guaranteed. Hence the stock market has had big setbacks. I think it will take considerable time, and I think it requires a policy-led initiative that's more proactive. But there is change taking place in many different aspects. Indeed, on the currency side, China's currency is becoming more used internationally. We calculate about 1/8 of Chinese trade is now denominated or paid for in the Chinese currency, even though it's not convertible. So coming back to Bill's question, there is change in the financial sector in China. But what many investors tend to do is if they're outside, they buy Hong Kong or they buy Western markets where companies are dealing in China or Asia and where the corporate governance is clearer.
Do you think that our engagement with China is aided or impeded by our ties with Europe? Quite topical to this week.
Aided or impeded? I remember a few years ago when Tony Blair was Prime Minister and the Great Hall of the People was mentioned at the very beginning. I remember the EU-China summit. I spoke in the Great Hall of the People about financial sector. And the reason for mentioning it is the Chinese guy who spoke after me was a senior policy person. And he said, we don't understand Europe. He said, America comes here. It's well, not his words, but basically it's a homogenous group. We understand America. We get Europe comes here as part of the EU. And then everyone goes back, and then they all come out by themselves. So Europe talks regionally, but acts nationally, in my view. China really, in my view, appreciates Mrs. Merkel. She's called Mrs. Europe in China. And Germany is seen as the economic powerhouse of Europe. It's seen as the political powerhouse of Europe. Some people in China argue, why shouldn't it be the financial powerhouse of Europe? But I think Britain should actually reposition itself. But in answer to your question, yeah, I think Britain should be thinking globally. I think my view about Europe is that if you think Europe's a prison, we should be outside it. If you think it's a castle, we'll be safer inside it. So it's partly influenced by how Europe behaves. Europe is behaving more like a prison at the moment, hence people in Britain want to be outside it. But whether we are in or outside it, I think we need to be thinking globally. And our relationship with China, I think, should be both supportive of what Europe's trying to achieve, but at the same time, we need to be doing our own thing. So a bit of a halfway house in answer to your question, but I understand where you're coming from. Thank you.
If you look at China in the long run, some people say that they are likely to suffer from a demographic problem.
Yeah.
Do you think that the move from middle income to high income income will take place before they will suffer the problem, or do you think that will keep them away from it?
It's like all the other questions, a very interesting one, because the phrase in China used to be that China would get old before it gets rich, which is the essence of this. But China is already about to get old, so I think it's evolutionary. There's no way, in my view, that China can sort out all its issues in the next 10 years, and yet its population is going to be getting older already in that time frame. So maybe it's getting older as it's getting richer as well. But what's interesting is that China has really forced other economies and other countries to start addressing issues as well. And so some of the themes in China are relevant in other countries, and those don't suffer the demographic issue. But the biggest growing part of the world's population is old people, which might relieve some people in this room. And it's partly China, it's partly Korea, partly Japan, and partly Europe as well. Yeah.
I think we've got time for a couple more questions. I'll be lazy and take one at the very front.
Alan Bain, American Scottish Foundation. I have a question about education.
Yes.
There's criticism that the educational system in the United States, for example, is not addressing the needs of business activity today.
Yeah.
And I wonder, is the Chinese educational system, where it exists, any different?
Yeah. Okay, I'm not an expert on China's education, so I'm not sure I'm best placed to answer this, so you're going to get a very biased perspective from me. I think that, yeah, what you do hear people say is that China's education system is more focused on things like sciences that in the West we don't really focus on. My own view is that in the West, certainly here in Britain, we are focusing too much about academic subjects. I think we need to be encouraging people to study anything. I'm certainly of the view that part of the problems in the financial crisis, because everyone thought the same and did the same, I think we should be having people who are just smart, who are artists, who are creative, who are academic as well. But in answer to your question, I think most people would say that the Chinese system is addressing more, has more expertise in the science area than we do in the West. Engineers are more prevalent. But certainly in China, China, the US, and China, UK is interesting. Britain is seen as being losing out at the higher education level because we're making it difficult with visas for students to come. And secondary school education, though, Britain is still doing relatively well, more with Southeast Asians, Malaysians, etc. So I don't know is the honest answer, but my perception is that China is more geared to business in answer to your question.
I think you wanted to ask one. Yeah.
Thanks. My name is Gonghua Yu. I work as a lecturer in the Sterling University. Yeah. My question, I mean, you talked about the soft infrastructure and hard infrastructure, and you're spot on. I think China is facing difficulties. But the trouble is, soft infrastructure is as it is in China for very good reasons, historical, cultural, power structure, and everything. Now, I think the West probably has done a lot, technology, materials, and what have you, to help China to build the hard infrastructure. And I'm just wondering, what sort of things do you think the West can do, or the outside of the world can do, to help China to build the soft infrastructure?
In terms of skills and education?
Well, either that or build up, actually, the soft infrastructure, institutional infrastructure.
Institution, I think the Chinese will have to build it for themselves, dependent on what the people want. And the relationship of the party to the rest of the country is probably the big problematic area there. But maybe putting it all together, I think one should be still positive about the world economy. One of the big challenges China poses for the West is commodity prices. China is absorbing commodities, it's buying up other parts of the world, as is Russia. So commodity prices have a firm floor, soft ceiling. And that's causing problems in the West. But I mention it because in the States, the response has been a technological response. And shale gas, one doesn't know whether it's everything it's made out to be. But in areas of energy, it's a commodity, a quantity, a price, or a technology reaction. And in energy, there's more of a technological response. And the reason for mentioning that is I think technology is probably the most interesting area as China develops, given its education system, but as the West has to develop further in technology. And I think when one looks globally, despite the lack of demand in the West, despite the problems in Europe, I think the technological advances are very exciting. And that's why I think when we put it all together, the growth of consumer durable markets in Asia, the growth of Indonesia, India, China, and also how we in the West will respond, it's not going to be a straight line path, but I think it will be far more positive than the negative sentiments out there at the moment.
What's your advice to the skill sets that younger people should acquire and the focus that they should be adopting?
Yeah, well, I think the most important thing is for people to be global and to embrace change. I think people do need to think internationally, regionally, as well as nationally, and also to be prepared to sort of be very proactive and change. The world economy is changing. So I think being international is a key underlying theme of that. So bringing together Scotland, Britain, and Asia, and implicit in that China is key. As you mentioned at the very beginning, the age of enlightenment. Well, you could argue we're going through another age of enlightenment at the moment. People are becoming enlightened about the dangers of debt at the moment. But more particularly, I think the size of the cake is getting bigger and the shape of the cake is changing. So in a nutshell, I think people here should, whatever they learn, and I don't think they have to learn an academic subject, whatever they learn, I think, as Adam Smith would say, play to your strengths by the invisible hand, and also think globally and think internationally.
Gerard, thanks. Well, on behalf of everybody here, I would like to thank Gerard. I was trying to think of some letters we could, a sort of 3 Ds, dynamic, and I ran out, ended up trying to think, but this has certainly been very, very interesting, a great tour d'horizon of what's going on in an enormously exciting market. I had a sign on my wall once that said, adapt or die. And for many of us who were brought up learning German or French or Spanish and looking at the American markets, it is clear that we and our children and their children need to embrace these extraordinarily exciting markets. And I would like to say on your behalf that this evening, we've heard from one of the leading thinkers in this area who's launched the Adam Smith series within our institute on this very topic. And you will have the opportunity over a drink outside to continue to talk with Gerard. And some of you later on, you know who you are going to stay for a small dinner with him on the 4th floor. So please join me in thanking Gerard Lyons.